Welcome everybody to the recording of the second half of the Developing the Conceptual Site Model, CSM, presentation from the Back to Basics Part 1, Developing the CSM and Site Characterization Plan workshop that NMOA hosted in March of 2018. Our presenter for the second half of the presentation is Ryan Wymore from CDM Smith. He's an associate in the Denver, Colorado office where he serves as a technical strategy leader focused on evaluation, selection, pilot testing, design, and operation of soil and groundwater remediation technology. He spent the last 18 years specializing in innovative remediation technologies, particularly in situ bioremediation, modern natural attenuation, in situ thermal remediation, in situ chemical reduction, in situ biochemical transformation, and in situ chemical oxidation. He's managed projects, designed and executed pilot studies, and served as lead engineer for design and implementation of full-scale remediation projects. He holds, he also is a 16-year member of the Interstate Technology Regulatory Council, the ITRC. He has been on membership of 8 technical teams and served as an instructor for 4 internet and classroom training seminars on DNAPL characterization remediation technologies, and which have been delivered to thousands of trainees worldwide. He also was on the ITRC Board of Advisors as an industry representative. Ryan holds a BS in Biological Systems Engineering from the University of Nebraska and MS in Civil and Environmental Engineering from the University of Idaho. He's also a registered professional engineer in Colorado. So we want to welcome Ryan. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. So I'm going to reiterate a few of the points that Michael made in the first part of this session. At its most basic level, the conceptual site model, the CSM, tries to connect the contaminant sources, integrates the geology at the site as well as exposure pathways. So because of that, the initial conceptual site model should have elements of geology and lithology, hydrogeology, everything that you know about the contaminants, including the presence and distribution of non-aqueous phases. It should have as much information about transport mechanisms as you can put together, and should also indicate key site features that maybe don't have to do with the aquifer itself, but can definitely impact transport, like utilities, what the site use and purpose is, and things like that, because those can greatly impact where the contaminants may be. So I want to illustrate this idea that CSMs, especially in the initial phases, can come in all shapes and sizes. So this next slide is probably what we would call an underwhelming conceptual site model, or one that needs work, that if your conceptual site model looks like this, you probably have some work to do, where you just are kind of having a source here, and then a plume and not really much definition to anything. So when you're thinking about what you would include in a conceptual site model, this is just another visualization of what you might consider. If you have DNAPLs present, that's obviously going to be a dominant factor in your CSM. Geology, this idea of back diffusion, if that plays a role at your site, if you have either a fractured rock setting or low permeability zones that may be distributed throughout your site. And then the idea of if you have a source zone and how that connects to a down gradient plume, if there's any treatment that has been conducted or is going to be conducted, what response you might get to that treatment, and then the overall contaminant distribution. So here's a very simple conceptual site model where we have a view or a cartoon, I guess, of a drum that has spilled some contaminants. In this case, we're saying it's a NAPL, and that's moving down through the subsurface. Maybe it's accumulating on some of these low permeability zones. It's certainly dissolving and moving off down gradient with groundwater. You may also infer that there's a vapor phase here. So this is kind of a simplified version of a CSM of a release. So here's a little bit more complex version. Let's say here it's a fractured rock site, and you have kind of the same concept where a spill occurred, and you have migration downward, but in this case, it's moving through fractures. So that's shown by the bright red. In this case, we're saying that bright red is the non-aqueous phase. So that may be a NAPL moving down through the fractures. At an intermediate time, some of that NAPL has dissolved into groundwater and starts to move down gradient. And then maybe at some later time, maybe this was a discrete release that is no longer contributing NAPL to the subsurface. So whether that was, stopped a couple of years ago or decades ago, you could have a plume that looks like the bottom picture here, where there really isn't that much mobile NAPL left, and you just have aqueous phase, but you also have diffusion into this matrix. So you potentially have a big matrix diffusion issue at this site. So this CSM kind of shows quite a few more features where you've got these different phases: aqueous, vapor, NAPL. You're depicting some fractures here, and then you're also depicting the idea of matrix storage and matrix diffusion. So here's another view of a CSM. So let's say you have a site where vapor intrusion is the big risk driver. So that's the pathway that is complete in terms of a receptor. So in that case, you're going to focus your CSM and how you depict it on the vapor phase. So here, maybe it was the same initial CSM where a DNAPL was released to the subsurface. So that may have led to groundwater contamination as the DNAPL moved downward, but also you have off-gassing from the groundwater. So the contaminant that made it into the aqueous phase is off-gassing into the vadose zone. There could have been volatilization of the DNAPL itself as it moved through the subsurface that can kind of create a halo. And maybe in this case, you're not as concerned with the dissolved contamination and what might be transporting in groundwater because, as we're showing here, you've got a resonance here. And you would obviously infer that this is shallow enough that the vapor intrusion is going to be an issue here. So this is just a different look at a conceptual site model. In this case, where the risk driver is maybe something a little bit different than what we usually think of. And of course, then you can go into things like trying to assess transport through the vadose zone, trying to calculate or directly measure what is actually making it into indoor air, what might happen if you're able to treat some of what's in the vadose zone or remove it or extract it. Maybe that would help clear up potential vapor intrusion issues. So another tool that we'd like to talk about, we've presented in a couple of the ITRC documents, is this 14 compartment model. This was originally developed by Tom Sale and Chuck Newell a few years back, and the ITRC DNAPL teams have kind of adopted this and put it in those documents just because it's a really good way to visualize where the mass is present at your site. So the 14 compartments, we're generalizing here by saying in both the source zone and the plume, there's a low permeability zone and a transmissive zone. Obviously, there could be multiple lithologies that are low permeability and transmissive, but we're kind of grouping those together here for sake of simplicity. And then with each one of those zones, which are the columns here, you have different phases, and those are the rows. So you could have a vapor phase, a DNAPL phase, aqueous phase, and sorb phase. And by definition, we don't have DNAPL in the plume, so that's why it's called the 14 compartment model instead of 16, because these two are kind of blacked out. But the idea is you can have mass in lots of these different compartments. If you have a vadose zone, like we showed on the vapor intrusion conceptual site model slide, and within the groundwater, you can have a separate NAPL phase, you can have dissolved, and then you can also have sorbed. So these arrows represent where the contaminant can undergo mass transfer from one compartment to another. Some of these are reversible and some of these are irreversible, and the irreversible ones are the dashed lines. So the idea is, if all you're doing is measuring or assessing groundwater concentrations, maybe in the transmissive zone, so you've got wells that are only completed in sand zones, let's say, you might only be getting at a couple of the compartments at your site where the mass could be an issue. So that's kind of the power of this, is it can help you visualize where the mass is being stored and transported. So we're not saying this is something quantitative where you can do a bunch of calculations and estimate down to the last milligram where your mass is, but it's a framework for thinking about your site. So you can refer to the ITRC documents for more description of this. Sorry about that. So kind of at the highest level, or maybe the most innovative or complete way to show CSM these days is with 3D visualization. So at CDM Smith, we like to use a program called Leapfrog. There's other ones that are out there that you can do this with, but essentially you're trying to input as much data as you can. So when you go out to a site and you collect soil borings and you collect soil and groundwater samples and those sorts of things, instead of manually building cross sections and making plume maps, you can enter those data into one of these visualization programs and actually have it interpolate and show volumes of contaminant mass, for example. So this is a site that I worked on actually with Michael, where we did exactly this. So we had some existing data. We went out and collected new data on the hydraulics as well as the contaminant distribution at the site. And then we put it all into this conceptual site model. So I'm just showing some screenshots here to give you a flavor for what you can do with this kind of a model. But basically what I'm showing, the brighter yellow is the TCE concentration at this site. And then the green, it's a little bit of cis-DCE that had shown up in one part of the site. And then these kind of light tan colors, these are actually visualizations of low permeability silt and clay. So at this site, you can see there is a creek over to the side that you would think a lot of this plume might discharge to. And in fact, that was kind of happening in the middle part of this screen around where the green is, where there was some contamination making it right up to the creek and into the sediments of the creek and whatnot. But in other parts of the plume, further north, it wasn't making it there, and no one was really sure why until we did this visualization. And that visualization showed that there is a big area of low permeability silt and silty sand zones here that are basically blocking the plume from moving to the creek. So this is kind of the power of putting everything together in one program and in one place where you can visualize it and look at it all together. So this is just a zoomed in version of what I just showed you. This is also a contaminant hotspot where concentrations were above 10 milligrams per liter, so you can set those kind of thresholds. Here we've just taken a cross section and now we're looking, so that creek is over here, we're kind of looking from south to north, just to show you how this has the third dimension that you can visualize, both in terms of the lithology and the contaminants. So this is a cross section. Another thing that you can do is actually you can post or you can enter existing cross sections. So this is actually from one of the reports that had been done for this site. So we put that into the model, and then we kind of built our data, these visualized volumes on top of that. So you can kind of see how it all can fit together. And this is just another view, again, kind of from down gradient. There was another area of the low permeability material down here that also was kind of preventing the plume from going further in that direction. And then one final cross section, just looking in a little bit different direction here. So another interesting thing about this site is below or beneath this kind of interbedded silts and sands, there was known to be a clay unit. So here's an example of where we were able to use existing data and add new data to it all in the model. So this is basically a contour map of underlying clay that was below these sands and silt units where all the contamination is. So this layer was known before we started out here, and there were existing data that had mapped the elevation of this clay this clay layer. And so we were just able to add to that with our data and kind of produce this updated contour map that shows the elevations of that clay unit. So in that case, it didn't tell us anything new, that didn't present some new understanding like we had with the contaminant distribution and the lithology, but what it did allow us to do was just get a better understanding, a more refined understanding of where that clay was. So just to summarize, again, when you're building a CSM, it's not a one-time activity. You do your best, the best that you can on your initial CSM that you're assembling based on available information. You want to identify data gaps that you have in that CSM. Then you plan activities to fill those data gaps. And then you use the new data and update your CSM and then see what else you need to know. Because every time you go through that process, you have the chance to discover new data gaps or understand areas you may need to investigate further. This can continue even as you're building a remedy. So don't think that just because maybe you've gotten to a record of decision or a decision document and it's time to go out and install the remedy, that you don't need to update your CSM. A lot of the sites that I've worked on, we learn some of the most valuable things while we're actually installing the remedy. So if it's a bunch of injection wells or something like that, you can learn as you're putting in those injection wells, and you can use those data to update your CSM. So at the end here, I've got kind of just a fun little example of how your conceptual site model may evolve over time. So here's our old friend, Alex Trebek. This is what he looks like present day, but let's think about what maybe an early phase CSM for Alex Trebek might have looked like. It's a good thing we have old game shows that show up on television and give us these kind of gems, because this is about 40 years previous to what he looks like now. So that's the end of this session. I'd like to turn it back over to Jennifer.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ryan, for all of that and all your help with these with the series. So I'm going to stop recording now. Thank you, everybody.